Welcome to the first IdentityNow session for Developer Days. My name's Colin McKibben, Lead Developer Advocate for SailPoint, and this session is all about the basics of APIs. It's meant for those of you who may not be as familiar with RESTful APIs, but what this will do is provide you with a solid foundation that will help you through the rest of the conference to understand a lot of the presentations that we're going to be giving. For those of you who are more comfortable with REST APIs, I encourage you to stick around because you may learn something new. So a little about me. I have a degree in computer science. Right out of school, I started at General Electric. I held roles as developer, product manager, and architect at that company. I then moved to Ford Motor Company, where I was an architect there, before moving to FireEye with Jordan to start a developer relations program there. So my developer advocacy role started at FireEye, and then I moved to SailPoint in 2020 to start developer advocacy at SailPoint. So a little fun fact about me, I grew up on a Christmas tree farm all my life. And to this day, I still enjoy cutting down my own Christmas tree to celebrate Christmas. So this photo here is a picture of me and my family. That's my wife and my daughter. That Christmas tree farm actually was really fun because the Hallmark Channel hosted an event there that day. And they wanted to take a picture of us while we were cutting down our tree. We said yes, and what they did was they compensated our tree. So not only do we get a free tree out of it, but you may have seen us on a Hallmark Channel. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. So in this session, I'm going to give an overview of REST, so what it is, how to make API calls. Then we're going to move on to authentication and authorization. And then finally, I'm going to give a demonstration of how to read the Open API specification that exists on developer.sailpoint.com. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer, which is basically a fancy way of saying communicating data over the HTTP protocol. So in REST, URLs represent something called an endpoint. An endpoint is a very specific resource that you're trying to get information about or take an action on. The endpoint is made up of the host name, so that'll be the host name of whatever company or service you're trying to connect to, followed by a base path, usually like a version number in the base path. This is a very static part of the endpoint that really doesn't change. And then usually there's a collection. So a collection describes a collection of resources. And it's a descriptive name for every resource that exists within it. And then finally you have the resource, which is the very specific piece of data that you're trying to access. Now usually the endpoints are made up of collection hierarchies. So you can think of that as kind of like a folder on your computer. So maybe you have a music folder where you store all of your music. So a collection hierarchy might be starting off with the music folder, and within the music folder you might have folders for all the different artists. And within each artist folder you might have all the album folders. And then finally within the album folders you actually have the resources, which would be the songs in MP3 format. Same thing with RESTful APIs. Typically they follow a collection hierarchy. So as you move down the path, it gets more specific until you finally reach that specific piece of data that you're trying to access. Now when you're identifying resources, usually REST APIs don't have user-friendly names for those resources. You often won't find, if you're looking for a user, you won't see their username show up in the URL. Typically what you'll see is a resource UID, which is a unique identifier. This is done for back-end reasons. It helps the computer uniquely identify whatever resource you're trying to access, but it's also done for URL friendliness. Sometimes human-friendly names don't really fit within the constraints of a URL. They have characters that can't be used. Now in REST, typically JSON is the language of REST. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and its ubiquity and flexibility and simplicity make it one of the most popular languages for web developers. So oftentimes you'll see JSON being used in REST APIs. JSON is very simple. It supports some simple data types such as strings, which are used for like descriptions or names or any text-based data. Numbers, which will be integers or decimals. Booleans will be true, false values. And then objects and arrays. So objects are a structuring of data that provide key name values to the data that's being represented. So an object will have a key name, So on our left here, we have an example of the info object. So info would be the key. The value would be another object. Animals is also a key, and the value would be an array. Objects can have nested objects, and they can nest infinitely. And then finally, arrays contain a list of any JSON data type value, including additional arrays or objects. So I was talking earlier how REST borrows a lot of conventions from the HTTP protocol. One of those borrowing actions is the HTTP verbs. So the verbs represent actions that you perform on a resource. So for example, if you want to create a new resource or execute an action, typically you'll use the post verb. So if I wanted to create a new Avenger, typically I would use a post to the Avenger's endpoint, and then I'd supply some data in the request body about that Avenger that I want to create. If you need to get data about a resource, you'll use the get verb. If you want to update a resource in its entirety, typically the put verb would be used. And then if you want to update certain fields within a resource, maybe one or two properties, patch is a common verb that would be used for that operation. And then finally, if you want to delete a resource, the delete verb is what's used there. Now, most APIs will follow these conventions, but some APIs may have different uses for these verbs. So it's important to read the docs to understand what actions are available and what they do. HTTP headers are metadata about the request and the response. So common headers that you might encounter are like the authorization header. This is where you'd put in your bearer token or API key so you can authenticate your requests. The content type typically tells the request, what kind of request payload you're sending, what the language is. Usually it's going to be JSON, but some servers accept XML or text. And then the accept is another common header. Usually that's in the response data, and it's the server telling your client or whatever you're using to call the API what data it's sending back. And again, it's typically JSON, but you could ask for other data formats if the server supports it. So headers are used to control how data is sent to and processed by the server. So some servers might accept a gzip header, which allows you to compress the data, either sending it there or sending it or receiving it back. And again, you can tell it what kind of data you want back. So you can say in the accept header, I want text as a response. Headers can also be used to learn more about the response data and take additional actions after a request has been completed. So in IdentityNow, we have a count header, where optionally you can ask the server to respond with a header that has the total number of records returned in the response, so you don't have to calculate that yourself. Some APIs will also return a deprecated header, just to inform users when an endpoint has been deprecated. As always, check the API spec to see what headers are supported by your API server. Query parameters are a way to explicitly control how data is processed and returned. They always appear on the URL, and it's just a simple way to query the data that you're trying to access. Query parameters always start with a question mark. That indicates the start of query parameters. And then you can have one or more query parameters by using ampersand between each query parameter to string them together. So in this example, this API allows for 2 query parameters. So we can say, give me all the car makes that are domestic and sort it by the name. And then when you get the data back, it will follow those query parameters. So it'll just be domestic cars and sorted by name. Now, RESTful APIs also borrow from the HTTP response codes. So response codes, if you've ever visited a web page and maybe you've seen like a 404 not found, that's an example of a response code. So in the case of RESTful services, a successful response will start with a 2. It'll be in the 200 series. At the most general level, you'll see a 200 as a successful request. That just means generally the request was successful. Maybe the response data has a more descriptive message or data that you were asking for. If you're trying to create a resource, typically you'll see a 201 response code returned, meaning that the resource was created. And if you're deleting data, typically you'll see a 204 response code. That just means that the server completed your request successfully, but it didn't have any data to return. The next series of response codes would be the client error response codes. That usually means something you provided in your request was invalid, and it's typically something you can fix yourself, but not always. These types of errors start with the 4, or then the 400 series. At the general level, you might get a 400 bad request. That just means generally the request failed. You should check the response message to see more specifically what happened. If maybe you didn't provide an access token or your access token is expired, you might receive a 401 unauthorized. Or if you're trying to access a resource that no longer exists, you might get a 404 not found. And then finally, there's the server error. This means that the server was unable to process the request for some reason. These types of response codes start with a 5. At the most general level, you get like a 500 server error. And again, you should check the response data to see if there's an explicit message saying what happened. Sometimes if the service is down, you might get a 503 service unavailable. All right, let's move on to authentication. So most REST APIs use an authentication model called OAuth 2. Not all of them do. Some use other forms of authentication like basic auth or just simple API keys. IdentityNow uses OAuth 2. So this is the process for typically how you'll authenticate with an OAuth 2 enabled API. So first you'll create an API key or credentials. These credentials can't be used directly to authenticate API requests. They are used on a special authentication endpoint to generate a token that you can then use to authenticate your requests. These credentials are long-lived, but they provide a means for you to create access tokens. So keep these credentials safe, secure, and then after you have that, you can then request an access token. So like I said, there's typically a special endpoint where you'll use these credentials to request an access token. Access tokens are short-lived and can expire within minutes or hours. An expired token typically results in a 401. So if you get that, usually just means you need to generate a new access token. And once you have an access token, then you can use that in the authorization header for the request that you're actually trying to make. All right, let's move on to a demonstration. So as I said, IdentityNow supports OAuth 2. There's kind of 2 main ways you can generate a token, and we're going to discuss how to do a personal access token. So I have my tenant opened here. Now any user can create personal access tokens. You don't have to be an admin. But what you do is when you're in your tenant, you go to your username in the top right, click on Preferences, and then Personal Access Tokens at the bottom. Now you can have up to 10 personal access tokens per user, so use them wisely. But if I want to create a new one, I click the button, give it a descriptive name. What kind of application is this being used for? Just so it helps manage it later on. Down here, you'll see scopes. We're going to talk about that in a later section. So right now, we're just not going to select any scopes. Once I click Create, you'll see that it provides you with the secret and the client ID. Now, the secret will only ever be presented to you once during this dialog box. So it's important that you save the client ID and secret somewhere safe and secure because you won't be able to get it again. And then here we go. We have a new personal access token. I'm going to go ahead and delete that for now. So as I was saying, IdentityNow supports OAuth 2. So there's another way to authenticate, and that's through grant types. So personal access token is actually a special type of grant type, a special type of client credentials grant type. So it doesn't follow this direction explicitly. But yeah, so OAuth 2, typically used for web authentication flows. If you're doing the authorization code, that means that your web application is requiring the user to authenticate the application, your application, so you can act on their behalf. This is common for web apps where you need to sign in to allow the web app to fetch your data. So it's similar to maybe if you've logged into a website and it says you can log in with Facebook or Google account. That's kind of like the same thing here is what's going on. You're logging in with your service provider so that the web app can act on your behalf. Now the refresh token grant type is often used in conjunction with the authorization code. This gives your application the ability to create new access tokens on behalf of the user without requiring them to log in again. So as I was saying earlier, the access token is short-lived. It may be a few minutes, maybe a few hours. You don't want your user to have to log into your app every couple hours. That'd be really annoying. So the refresh token allows your app to specify a duration that it can continue to generate new access tokens before another login is required. This could be a month, a couple months, maybe even a year if you need be. And then finally, there's the client credentials grant type. This is used to generate an access token outside the context of a user. So what I mean by that is it's a token that isn't assigned to a user and therefore has no privileges that a user might have. Now in IdentityNow, there are very few APIs that you can access with just a purely client credentials grant type. Most APIs require some sort of user context. The only exception is when you create a personal access token, that is a special type of client credentials that does have a user context. All right, so let's do a demonstration on how to create OAuth 2 credentials. Now to create OAuth 2 credentials, you do need to be an admin. So I'm going to go to the admin page on my tenant. Then I'll go to the global settings and security settings. On the left-hand side, you'll see API management. And this is a list of all of your OAuth credentials. Now, there's no limit on OAuth credentials. You can have much more than the personal access tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. Again, give it a description so you know later on what it's being used for. And here you can see the grant types. So you can select one grant type or any combination of the grant types. So if I select authorization code, you'll see it's asking for a redirect URL. That would be the URL to the web app that you're building so that your web app can receive the token once the user has logged in. As I said, oftentimes refresh token is used with authorization code to extend the life of the token so users don't have to log in as often. Now you can select how long the refresh token is good for. So at a minimum, a month. That means the user only has to log in once a month, up to 2 years. And again, you can apply scopes to your OAuth credentials. But I'll be covering that in the next section, so we're going to leave that blank again. Now I click Create, and just like the personal access token, you will again receive a client ID and secret. Again, copy those, keep those safe because they won't be presented to you again. And I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. All right, now on to authorization. So what's the difference between authentication and authorization? Well, authentication is verifying that you are who you say you are, whereas authorization is verifying that you are allowed to access the thing you're trying to get access to. These are separate things, but they are used together to secure access to an API. One of the main ways that RESTful APIs will apply authorization to their security model is through something called scopes. So scopes are fine-grained access controls to one or more endpoints, usually not a whole lot of endpoints, but a few endpoints. They can be mix and match, so when you create a new API token, you can have one or more scopes. You can mix and match them kind of a la carte, depending on the access your token needs. Scopes are a security feature that limits the breadth of access a token has. So from a developer standpoint, I want a token that has the least amount of privilege possible so I don't accidentally use an API I wasn't supposed to or use it in a way that was inappropriate. It's kind of a safeguard for me so I don't have to worry about doing things that aren't allowed. Now from an attacker standpoint, if your token is compromised in any way, maybe you accidentally committed your token to GitHub or somehow it got leaked, the attacker can only do what the token has been scoped to do. So if your token is only allowed to read data from one endpoint, well, it sucks that the token got leaked, but they can only do that one thing, which is read data. As long as it's not sensitive data, the threat of the attack is very much minimized. So let's look at an example. So maybe we have a car data API that has data all about cars. Token 1, the green token, is generated for an admin who needs to manage all of the car data. So the admin needs the following scopes. the ability to create and update cars, delete cars, and get all cars. So his token is assigned all three of those scopes. Now, user 2 is for a small website that specializes in the history of cars. She only needs the following scope: get all cars, because all she has to do is present that data on her website. So her token just has that, get all cars. And if her token is compromised, her token can't be used to do any of the destructive actions. Now, IdentityNow has another form of authorization called user levels, and this has been around much longer than our scopes feature. So IDN implements both scopes and user levels. User levels are sets of permissions within IdentityNow that administrators can grant to users. And they're often following common roles that users of IdentityNow need to perform, like report admin, cert admin, or even org admin. User levels cover a broader range of access than scopes, so they should be used in tandem to refine the access of each API user with scopes. So we look at the admin user level. Let's say you have a user in IdentityNow who's an admin. Because they have that admin user level, they have access to every API in IdentityNow. Now that may not be desirable when they're developing an application, so they can use scopes to start a very, very granular level and minimize the amount of access that token has. Now maybe you have a user who's a report admin. So being that report admin user level, right off the bat, they have access to a far fewer set of APIs in IdentityNow, but it's still a lot. So maybe this particular report admin only needs to do a certain kind of report where only one endpoint is involved. So you can give their token just that one scope, and their token will only be able to call that API. So let's look at a demonstration of how to set a user level and scopes on a token. So to set user levels, as an admin, I can go into the identity list. I can search for the identity that I want to set the user level on. We'll just start with the first one here. If I click on the Actions button here, you'll see there's an option to set user levels. And here are the user levels that are available in IdentityNow. As I was saying earlier, admin is access to all of the APIs, whereas all of these other user levels have different subsets of the entire collection of APIs. We do have documentation on our developer.salepoint.com that provides more information about these user levels, so I encourage you to check that out and read up on specifically what kind of access they have. Now, once you set the user level for a user, when they go to generate a token, they now have the ability to assign scopes to that token. Now, as soon as I select one of these scopes, maybe this token I only wanted to be able to read access profiles, whatever access the user level granted is now minimized to just that particular set of endpoints that scope grants. So we go from having broad access from an admin level, or whatever user level you're at, to just a singular access for the scope that I granted. Now I can add more scopes and start building up that permission back to the full set that originally the user level granted. So yeah, I can mix and match them. There are two special scopes. SP scopes default. This is the default scope that is applied if you don't select any scopes. This is restricted by default. So if this is applied, basically means you have no scopes. You can only call APIs that don't require user context, which there are very few of in IdentityNow. On the other hand, there's SP scopes all. So this is a shorthand for basically granting all access that user level has permission to. Now let's say I select these three scopes, because that's what I want my token to have. I create it. It gives me my client ID and secret. You can now see here that the scopes are applied to that token. If at any point you need to modify those scopes, maybe remove a scope, or throughout testing you realize I need access to another scope to do what I need to do, you can always edit the scopes later. Next up, how to read OpenAPI documentation. So OpenAPI is a standard for describing RESTful APIs. So it's important to be able to understand how to read API documentation so that you can quickly find access to the endpoints that you need and how to use them, what kind of data to expect back. It's a very important part of discovery and testing of your APIs. So I'm going to go to the IdentityNow APIs. So if I hover over the IdentityNow product, you can see we have two API specifications. I'm going to click on the v3 APIs. Up at the top here, we have some information that isn't a part of the OpenAPI spec, but it's useful information on how to use the API. So we have a getting started guide, making your first API call. We have the authentication guide, which goes into more depth about the OAuth 2 model that we have and how to generate tokens. There's an authorization guide that covers user level permissions and scopes. There's information about standard collection parameters, so that's common across all of our GET endpoints. How you can limit and sort and filter data. And then finally, rate limiting. Most APIs have rate limiting to make sure that no one's abusing the system. But this is information about the rate limits, so how many requests per second that you can call before we start to throttle your requests. Now, once we get to the v3 APIs, this is part of the spec, but we present it in a very user-friendly way. So you can see all of the different collections we have here. These collections group endpoints based on similar functionality. So if I need to do something with access profiles, I can click that, and I can see all of the endpoints that are related to access profiles. So you can see here we have the verb that is being used, get, post, put, patch, delete, followed by a summary of what the endpoint does. So this first endpoint you can read as getting a list of access profiles. If I click on that, we now have more information about this endpoint. There's a description about what it does, and maybe some more contextual information about things that you might need to know in order to call this API. In this case, it tells you which user levels you would need in order to call this API. Our GET endpoints and some of our POST endpoints will also have query parameters defined here. So this is where you'll find information about the query parameters that each endpoint supports, descriptions about them, and even an example value that you can use for that query parameter. On the right-hand side, you can see there's the verb that you need to use to call the endpoint. There is the path for the endpoint. There's an authorization section. So if you click that, it expands out, and you can see what kind of OAuth flows you need. Personal access tokens are client credentials, so a personal access token will be able to call this endpoint. Also, the scopes needed to call the endpoint. Now, scopes are an early feature right now within IdentityNow, so many of our endpoints still don't have scopes, but we are actively adding those over time. So you might find some endpoints that don't have any scopes defined. Just know that they will be there eventually. But yeah, this scope means that I need this particular scope assigned to whatever token in order to access that endpoint. Scrolling a little further down, you can see the base URL. This defaults to a generic SailPoint.api host name. You'll just need to replace that with your tenant name, or if you have a vanity URL, you just replace the whole host name with that. And also provide the base path, which in this case is v3. So if you combine the base URL with the endpoint path, you have the full URL that you need to access the endpoint. Scrolling further down, we have example code snippets to call this API. So I can click on the penguin here and get a example curl request. Most of the fields are already filled out, so it'll already fill out the host name and the endpoint. It won't fill out the bearer token. It doesn't know what that is yet, so you can pop those details in. Maybe you're building an application in Python and you need to know how to make that API call in Python. Well, you can click on the Python code sample and it gives you a full-featured code snippet that you can copy and paste into a file and change a few values and run it, and it'll work. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see the response codes. So every API might be a little different in terms of which successful response code it will return. Our GET endpoints typically return a 200. So you can see when I click on the 200 response code, it'll tell you that the schema of the response data that the server will send back. So this is information about the type of data, description for each property, and yeah. Now that's kind of hard to read. So you can also click on this example, and this will give you an example of the data that the server will give your application back. And this is very useful for understanding which fields you need for your application. We also list the different error codes that you might receive from the endpoint, as well as what kind of response message you might get back. So if you get a 400, you might receive something that looks similar to this. You can always scroll over to see the full list of error codes, but most of the endpoints follow the same set of error codes. Now let's take a look at a post request. So to create an access profile, I click on that endpoint. We have a little more in our description, and there's actually a little more contextual information about this endpoint. It's not something you can represent in the API spec, so we have to put it in the description. Just things like the field description limit is 2,000 characters. It's important to read the descriptions for each endpoint just to catch any bit of information you might need to use it. Post endpoints are a little different. They'll typically have a request body. So the request body they'll show you the schema of the data that you have to send to the server in order to perform the action. So in this case, if you want to create an access profile, you got to provide a request body that has details about that profile. On the right-hand side, you'll see an example body. So kind of like the example response you might get back down below. This is an example body that you can send to the API. So an example of how to create an access profile. When I scroll down, again, we still have the same code snippets. So whatever language you're using, you can copy that data and modify it to your needs. The responses, you can see it change a little bit. So the success response on the post request is a 201. That's what you should expect back if it was successful. But the response schema down here is still the same thing. It'll tell you what kind of data to expect back, as well as an example. So that concludes the presentation for the API introduction. I hope you all found something useful out of it. And again, I think this is going to provide a really good foundation for the rest of the conference to help you understand what the presenters are talking about. Thank you, and I will see you shortly.